Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
A few years ago, I was working as a night shift nurse in a mid-sized hospital. It wasn't one of those massive medical centers, but it was big enough that you could go entire shifts without seeing some of your coworkers. One night, I was assigned to a floor that specialized in post-opus recovery. Most of the patients were stable, just resting until they were cleared to go home. It was usually a quiet shift, and I liked that. At around 2 a.m., I was making my rounds when I saw that a call light was on for room 409. It was odd because, as far as I knew, that room was empty. The patient who had been in there earlier was discharged before my shift started. I figured maybe one of the aides had forgotten to reset the system, so I walked over intending to turn it off. When I pushed the door open, I stopped. The bed was occupied. A woman lay there, covered up to her chest with a thin hospital blanket. Her eyes were open, staring straight at the ceiling. At first, I thought maybe I had been mistaken. Maybe a patient had been moved here without me realizing. They had been. I asked, stepping closer, "Do you need something?" She didn't respond. She didn't blink. Something about the air in the room felt wrong, heavy, stagnant. The usual hum of machines was absent. No monitors, no IV drips, just silence. I reached for the chart at the end of the bed. It was empty. No name, no records, nothing to indicate that anyone should be in this room. Then the call light switched off. I hadn't touched it. I backed out of the room immediately and hurried to the nurse's station. I asked the charge nurse if someone had been moved into 409 without my knowledge. She frowned. 409, and she asked, "That room's been empty all day." I told her what I saw. She gave me a look. They got up and walked with me back to the room. The bed was empty, neatly made, as if no one had been in it at all. I knew what I saw. The worst part, when we checked the system logs, the call light for room 409 had been activated at 2:03 a.m., but there had been no record of anyone turning it off. After that night, I did my best to avoid room 409. If I had to pass it during my rounds, I'd walk faster, keeping my eyes down. I never volunteered to check on anything in there, but hospitals have a way of making you face what you don't want to, and a few weeks later, I was assigned to that section again. It was a particularly hectic night, and I barely had time to think. Around 1:45 a.m., I finally sat down at the nurse's station to catch up on charting. That's when one of the newer aides, Jessica, walked up to me. "Hey," she said, frowning. "The woman in 409 is asking for a nurse." I stopped typing. "There's no one in 409, I said carefully. Jessica blinked. "Oh yeah, there is." She just pressed the call light. I looked at when I walked by, and I saw her lying there. She looked, I don't know, kind of out of it. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. Jessica must have noticed the look on my face because she took a step back. "What?" I grabbed the patient assignment list and held it out to her. 409 is empty, I said. "No one is in that room." Jessica let out a nervous laugh, but when I didn't smile, her expression darkened. "You're joking, right?" I saw her. I didn't want to go back to that room, but I knew Jessica wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't check. So together, we walked back down the hall. The door to room 409 was cracked open slightly. A faint glow from the nightlight inside spilled out into the hall. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open all the way. The bed was empty. The blanket was neatly folded, the pillow untouched. But as I stepped inside, a chill passed over me like the kind you get when you walk into a freezer. Jessica stayed at the threshold. "I swear I saw someone," she whispered. I moved closer to the bed, looking around for any sign that someone had been there. But there was nothing. No creases in the sheets, no indentation on the pillow, just that overwhelming rawness hanging in the air. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The call light button. It was sitting on top of the blanket, right in the center of the bed, like someone had placed it there deliberately. Jessica saw it too. She took a step back. "I'm not going back in there," she muttered. I nodded. Together, we backed out of the room, and I pulled the door shut. Later, when I told some of the older nurses what had happened, one of them, a woman who had worked at the hospital for over 20 years, gave me a strange look. 409, and she asked, "That was Margaret's room." "Who's Margaret?" I asked. The nurse hesitated. Then she sighed. "She was a patient a long time ago. Older lady, had surgery, was supposed to recover fine, but one night, she just coded. No one knows why. It was unexpected. She was alone when it happened." I swallowed hard. "Sometimes, new staff see her," she continued, lowering her voice. "They think she's just another patient, until they realize she shouldn't be there. I never worked in that section again if I could help it, but every now and then, I'd hear whispers from new nurses talking about room 409, about the woman in the bed, the one who stares at the ceiling, and the call light that always turns turns off by itself. After that night, I made a point to avoid room 409 at all costs. If I had to work that wing, I'd trade tasks with another nurse, making excuses to keep my rounds away from that room. Most of the time, it worked, but a hospital never lets you outrun the things you don't want to see. One night, about 2 months later, I was put on a short-staffed shift. We were running thin, and I had more patients than usual to check on. I was already exhausted when, around 3:10 a.m., I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. A faint, rhythmic beep, the sound of a heart monitor. That might not seem strange, except room 409 had no equipment in it. I stood frozen outside the nurse's station, listening. The beeping was steady, slow, almost calming, if it weren't coming from an empty room. Jessica, the same maid who had seen the woman weeks ago, was on shift that night too. She walked by, noticed my expression, and followed my gaze. Then she heard it too. Is that... She trailed off. I nodded. Neither of us moved for a long moment. The beeping continued, unchanging, unwavering. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Complete silence. Jessica exhaled sharply. Nope, I'm done. And before I could stop her, she walked straight past the room and down the hall, shaking her head. I didn't blame her, but for some reason, maybe exhaustion, maybe the deep, nagging feeling in my gut, I found myself moving toward the room. The door was slightly ajar, just like before. The light from the hallway barely illuminated the inside. I reached out, hesitant, and nudged the door open wider. The bed was empty. Of course, it was, but this time, something was different. The monitor was AI. It sat beside the bed, plugged in, the screen faintly glowing. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it again, that unbearable heaviness. Like the air itself didn't want me there. I swallowed hard and took a step back, my fingers tightening around the doorframe. And then the call light turned on and I read. I didn't look back. I didn't check the system log. I just ran. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night, not even Jessica. But from that point on, I refused to work anywhere near room 409. I swapped shifts, traded assignments, did everything I could to stay away. A few weeks later, the hospital renovated that wing, moving the rooms around. The numbers changed. Room 409 no longer existed, but sometimes, late at night, when the halls are quiet and the patients are sleeping, I still hear it. The faint, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, even when no machines are running. I used to spend a lot of time in the student union, mostly because it had comfortable chairs, free Wi-Fi, and an endless supply of overpriced coffee. The building had this sort of open floor design, with lounge areas scattered between food vendors and study spaces. It always felt busy but safe. There were always people around. Near the back, there was a chess table, not one of those portable sets, but an actual wooden table with the board built into the surface. The pieces were always there, and anyone could sit down and play. Most of the time, people ignored it, except for this one man. He wasn't a student, that much was obvious. He looked to be in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, always wearing the same dark green windbreaker, even when it was warm outside. He had these sunken eyes and a thin, twitchy frame, like he never quite settled into his own skin. He never spoke to anyone, just sat at the chess table every day, idly moving the pieces, sometimes playing against himself. I first noticed him my sophomore year. I passed by the table, and he'd always be there, staring at the board, never looking up. No one ever sat with him, and he didn't have a backpack, a laptop, or even a book. Just existed there, playing chess with himself. One day, I made the mistake of sitting too close. It was finals week, and all the usual seating areas were packed. The only open chair was at a small round table just a few feet from the chessboard. I hesitated, then sat down, pulling out my laptop. At first, he didn't react. He just kept playing his silent game. Then, I noticed something weird. He wasn't playing correctly. He'd move a piece, stare at it, then put it back, over and over. It was like he was waiting for someone to respond, but no one was there. That's when he spoke. "You play." His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a while. I looked up, unsure if he was talking to me. His eyes, dark and unblinking, were locked onto mine. I know the basics," I said. He smiled, but it wasn't right. Too wide, too many teeth. "Good," he whispered. "You should know the rules." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I glanced around. The union was still crowded, full of students chatting, studying, scrolling on their phones. Normal life continued as if this man wasn't sitting a few feet away, grinning at me like he knew something I didn't. I forced a polite smile and looked back at my screen. I figured if I ignored him, he'd lose interest. Then, he started moving the pieces again, slowly, deliberately, except now, he was whispering, "Pawn to e4, knight to c6, bishop to b5. I didn't recognize the sequence, but something about the way he said it, soft and measured, like a chant, made my skin crawl. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to something else. I shut my laptop. I should get going. That's when he did something I'll never forget. forget. He slammed his hand down on the board, scattering the pieces. Several of them clattered to the floor. The noise wasn't loud, but it felt deafening. No, he hissed. Not yet. I froze. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze was fixed on the empty chair across from him. Something in me snapped. I grabbed my bag and practically ran. As I hurried toward the exit, I made the mistake of glancing back. He was still staring at the empty chair, and he was nodding. I avoided that part of the student union after that. If I had to go inside, I'd take the long way around, just to make sure I never passed that chess table. A few weeks later, I noticed something strange. The chess set was gone. The table was still there, but the pieces had vanished. I asked one of the employees at the coffee shop nearby if they had moved it. His face went pale. There was never a chess set there. I didn't argue. I just nodded and walked away, my heart hammering. I never saw the man again, and I hope I never do. A year passed, and I had almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been some kind of bizarre hallucination. Stress, lack of sleep, too much caffeine. Maybe my brain had just filled in the blanks of something completely mundane. Then, one night, I found something. It was late, maybe 11 p.m., and I was pulling an all-nighter in the library. Finals were creeping up again, and I had made the brilliant decision to procrastinate until the last possible moment. The library was nearly empty. The only sounds the occasional cough were the quiet tapping of keys from students just as desperate as I was. I was on the 3rd floor, tucked away in one of the study cubicles. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a dim glow over the long rows of bookshelves. It was peaceful in a lonely kind of way. I stretched, rubbing my eyes, and decided to take a short break. Standing up, I wandered toward the shelves, running my fingers absent-mindedly along the spines of books. That's when I saw it. Tucked between two thick reference books was a single chess piece. A black knight. I stared at it, my brain struggling to catch up. It wasn't like someone had just left a chess piece lying around. This one was wedged carefully between the books, as if placed there deliberately. Slowly, I reached out and picked it up. It was ice cold. The moment my fingers closed around it, I heard something. A whisper. Pawn to e4. The exact words the man had muttered at the chess table. I spun around, heart pounding, but the library was still empty. No one was there. I set the knight back down and walked away quickly, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Just a weird coincidence. But then, as I made my way back to my study cubicle, I noticed something else. On my table, right next to my laptop, was another chess piece. A white queen. I had to put it there. I didn't touch it. I grabbed my stuff and left. After that night, things got worse. I started seeing glimpses of him. Not often, and never for long, but enough to make my stomach drop every time. A flash of a green windbreaker disappearing around a corner. A hunched figure sitting on a bench, staring at nothing. Once, I even caught a reflection in a window, a face staring at me from just over my shoulder. But when I turned, no one was there. And then, the dream started, always the same. A chessboard in the middle of an empty room. Pieces moving on their own. A dark figure sitting across from me, hands folded neatly in front of him. And a voice whispering, "You're both. I don't know what you wanted. I don't know what I was supposed to do. All I know is that I stopped playing chess after that. I graduated and moved away, and for a long time, I thought it was over. But a few nights ago, I got a package in the mail. No return address, no note, just a small wooden box. Inside was a single chess piece, a black king. I put it back in the box and shoved it in the back of my closet. I don't know what happens if I play, and I don't want to find out. I tried to ignore it. I really tried. The box with the chess piece sat untouched in the back of my closet, buried beneath old clothes and forgotten notebooks. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just some elaborate prank. But then the text started. The first one came at exactly 3:04 a.m. Unknown number, Yaboof. I stared at my phone, my breath caught in my throat. It had to be a mistake. A wrong number. I didn't respond. The next night, at the exact same time, unknown number, pawn to e4. I blocked the number. It didn't matter. The next night, a different number, the same message. This went on for a week. Each time, a different number. Each time, the same move. And then, something worse. One night, I woke up before the text came. It was instinct, like something had yanked me out of sleep. My room was dark, but something felt off. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking. 3:03 a.m. 1 minute before the text would arrive. I held my breath, waiting. Then, a soft tap, not from my phone, from inside my closet. I went still, my fingers tightening around the sheets. It was so quiet, I thought I imagined it. Then it came again. Tap, 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 slow, methodical, like someone or something was knocking from the inside. I forced myself to move. I reached for for the lamp and flicked it on, my eyes darting to the closet. The door was closed, but something was wrong. The door handle, it was turned halfway down, like someone had pressed their fingers against it but stopped. I stared, my skin crawling. Then, just as the clock hit 3:04 a.m., my phone buzzed. I almost dropped it. My hands were slick with sweat as I looked down at the screen. The message was different this time. Unknown number, you're taking too long. That was the night I left. I packed a bag and drove to a motel, not even bothering to lock my apartment door behind me. I didn't care. I just needed to be away. For a while, it seemed to work. The text stopped. The knocking stopped. Then, 2 nights ago, I came home. The box, the one with the chess piece I had shoved deep into my closet, was sitting on my kitchen table. The lid was open. The black king was gone, and in its place, a folded slip of paper with 4 words written in perfectly neat handwriting. Checkmate. Say so. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I know one thing. I should have never sat at that table. I was a nursing student at the time, completing my clinical rotations at a mid-sized hospital. It wasn't a prestigious medical center or anything, just a regular hospital with the usual influx of patients, mostly elderly or recovering from surgeries. One night, I was assigned to the night shift for the first time. I wasn't alone, there were 2 other students with me, and of course, the supervising nurses. But the hospital at night had a completely different feel. The bright, bustling energy of the day shift faded into something much quieter, but also, there at around 2 a.m., one of the nurses asked me to check on a patient in room 309. The patient, an older man, had undergone surgery earlier that day and needed his vitals checked. I grabbed the chart and made my way down the dimly lit hallway. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The room felt unusually cold, even from the outside. I knocked softly before stepping in. The room was dark, with only the faint glow of the monitors casting shadows across the walls. The bed was positioned near the window, and at first, I thought the patient was asleep. But something felt off. His breathing was shallow. His chest barely moved. I glanced at the monitors. His heart rate was low, dangerously low. I turned to leave and get the nurse, but as I did, the man in the bed sat up. Not slowly, not groggily, he just sat straight up, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. I froze. His face was turned slightly away from me, but I could see his profile. His eyes, they were open, but unfocused. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Sir," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned his head toward me, too fast, too sharply, and I felt my stomach drop. His eyes were wide now, locked onto mine, and then he smiled, a slow, creeping smile that did not belong on the face of someone who had just been unconscious moments ago. A deep, raspy whisper came from his throat. "You're not supposed to be here." I took a step back. The room suddenly felt suffocating. "I'll get the nurse," I stammered, but as I turned to go, the voice behind me whispered again. "Wrong route." I bolted. I didn't walk. I didn't check the hallway. I just ran. I nearly crashed into the nurse at the station, my words tumbling out in a panic. I told her something was wrong with the patient in 309, that his vitals were bad, that he was awake and talking strangely. She frowned, flipping through the records. 309, she repeated, looking confused. "Yes, he needs help." She shook her head. "There's no one at 309. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. "What?" She turned the chart around, pointing at the entry for room 309. "The patient in that room passed away 3 hours ago." I felt the air leave my lungs. The nurse must have noticed the color drain from my face because she quickly added, "They moved his body to the morgue already. The room is empty." I shook my head. No, I was just in there. He was in the bed. He sat up. He spoke to me. Her expression darkened. She didn't look at me like I was crazy. She looked unnerved. That made it worse. "Are you sure it was 309? She asked carefully. I turned my head back toward the hall, my pulse hammering in my ears. I knew where I had gone. I had checked the door number. "I'm sure," I whispered. The nurse stood up. "Stay here," she said before walking down the hallway. I sat at the station, my hands shaking. My other classmate looked at me with concern, but I couldn't even form the words to explain. When the nurse returned a minute later, she was frowning. I felt like I was losing my mind. I had seen him. He had looked right at me. And then I remembered what he had whispered. "Wrong route." I left my clinical shift early that night. No one made a big deal about it. Maybe they saw the look on my face and figured I wasn't in a state to keep working. But I didn't sleep when I got home. I just kept replaying that moment over and over. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had been sleep deprived. Maybe the stress of night shifts had gotten to me. Maybe I had just imagined it. But here's the thing. A few days later, I overheard 2 nurses talking near the break room. "Yeah, 309. It's always 309. One of them muttered. My stomach clenched. I pretended to be looking at my phone, but I listened. The last one saw something too. The other nurse whispered they had to send her home. She wouldn't stop crying. Did she say what she saw? A pause. Then, quietly, he sat up. He smiled at her. I left that hospital at the end of my clinical rotations and never went back. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I left the hospital, finished my rotations, and never thought about room 309 again. But strange things don't always let you go just because you walk away. After that night, I tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination from exhaustion, that my brain had filled in details where there were none. But deep down, I knew better, and it wasn't until I started my residency at a completely different hospital in a completely different city that I realized I hadn't really escaped. It started small. During my first week, I was assigned to the step-down unit, the floor where patients went when they no longer needed intensive care, but still required monitoring. One night, I was doing rounds when I glanced at the room list. My stomach turned to ice. Room 309. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Every hospital had a 309. It wasn't the same hospital. It wasn't the same room. Still, when I approached the door, I hesitated. A deep unease settled in my chest. The patient inside, a woman recovering from pneumonia, was fast asleep, her breathing steady, the soft beep of the monitors normal. Nothing was wrong. I exhaled in relief and turned to leave. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The monitor screen dimmed, its glow shrinking like something had stepped in front of it, and then, from the darkness near the foot of the bed, I saw something shift. A shape, too tall, too thin, watching. I flipped on the room light, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The patient stirred slightly, but she didn't wake. The monitor flickered back to its normal glow. I stood there for a long time, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I scanned every corner of the room, checking the machines, the chairs, even behind the curtains. Nothing. I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That his shadow had blocked the monitor, that I felt something watching me. No, it sounded ridiculous, but it didn't stop. The next week, I was restocking supplies in an empty room when I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, "Wrong route." I spun around, my back slamming against the cabinet. The room was empty. The door was closed. My skin crawled. I stopped doing rounds alone after that. I'd like to say I never encountered it again, but the truth is, I don't think it ever left me. Even now, years later, every hospital I work in, every shift I take, I always glance at the room list first. Because if there's a room 309, I refuse to go inside. And if I ever hear those words again, wrong group, I know better than to look. I work as a piano tuner, not the most thrilling job, but it pays well and I like the solitude. Most of my clients are concert halls, schools, and the occasional private collector with more money than musical ability. I've been doing this for years, and I thought I'd seen everything until last summer. It started with an email, a new client, someone I'd never worked with before. The message was brief. Wrong piano needs tuning, urgent, will pay extra for short notice. Address below, no name, just an address in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. The urgency and the offer of extra payment were odd, but not unheard of. Some people get obsessed with getting their instrument perfect, and I never turned down extra cash. When I arrived, the house didn't match the address on the email. It was old, half swallowed by ivy, like no one had lived there for years. The windows were dark, the porch sagging. For a second, I wondered if I had the wrong place, but then I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated. I should have left, but I had driven over an hour to get there, and something about the air that night, thick and heavy like the sky was pressing down, made me reluctant to go back empty-handed. Inside, the house smelled stale, like wood rot and something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with empty frames, their glass long gone. Dust coated everything except for a single trail of footprints leading deeper into the house. I followed them in. The piano was in the center of what might have once been a ballroom. A massive grand piano, black lacquered, its surface spotless despite the rest of the house's decay. It looked rugged. The proportions were slightly off, like it had been built to fit someone's memory of a piano rather than an actual instrument. I sat on the bench, lifted the lid, and struck a key, a low C. The sound was rugged, not out of tune, just off, like hearing your own voice in a recording and realizing it doesn't sound how you imagine. I pressed another key, then another, the same unsteadily resonance. The longer I played, the more it felt like the notes weren't just vibrating in the air, but sinking into the walls, into me. I stopped, out of tune. The voice came from behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. A man stood in the doorway, tall and thin, his suit hanging loosely off his frame. His face was hard to focus on, like my eyes refused to land on any one feature. I cleared my throat. "Oh yeah, it's definitely..." He nodded, stepping into the room. His shoes left no prints in the dust. "You can fix it." I swallowed. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my hands acted on autopilot, reaching into my bag for my tools. I plucked at one of the strings, listening. It wasn't just out of tune, it was wrong. The wire was vibrating in a way I'd never seen before, like it was alive. I hesitated. "Where did you get this piano?" The man's head tilted slightly slightly. It's always been here. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Who else plays it? He smiled. It plays itself. I stood up, knocking over my stool. I think I should go. He didn't stop me. He just stood there, watching as I backed out of the room. As soon as I stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The pressure in my chest eased. I practically ran to my car. When I turned back, the house, it wasn't there. Just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. I don't take last-minute tuning jobs anymore, and I don't play pianos unless I can hear them first. I don't know how long I sat in my car, staring at that empty lot. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd written the address wrong. Maybe I was overtired, hallucinating, but I felt that house. The dust under my shoes, the weight of the keys under my fingers, the wrongness of the sound. I started my car and drove fast the whole way home. I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, expecting to see the man in the loose suit standing in the middle of the road, but there was nothing, just the hum of my tires on pavement and the sick feeling growing in my stomach. When I got home, I did something I never do. I turned my phone off and locked every door in my apartment. I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Maybe the stress of work had finally gotten to me. Maybe it was a prank. But then, 2 nights later, I got another email. Same address, no subject, no body, just an attachment, a single audio file. I stared at it for a long time, my pulse pounding. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew, deep down, that whatever was in that file wasn't meant to be heard. But I clicked it anyway. At first, it was nothing, just the soft ambient noise of an empty room. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of a piano. 3 notes, low, dissonant, rug, the same notes I had played in that house. The sound was warbled, distorted, like it was being played underwater, and under the notes, so faint I almost missed it, was breathing. Not normal breathing, not steady inhales and exhales. It was ragged, like someone gasping through a mouthful of dirt. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen, listening to my own breathing, trying to convince myself it was a joke, that someone had followed me, recorded me, altered the sound. But I knew better. That wasn't my recording. That wasn't my breathing. I didn't sleep at night. I lay in bed, every shadow stretching too far across my ceiling, every creak of my apartment settling, sending a fresh bolt of adrenaline through my system. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a sound, a single piano note. From my living room, I froze, my body stiff with fear. My own piano, a small upright I'd had since college, sat against the far wall, untouched. I hadn't played it in weeks. I sat up slowly, my ears straining. Another note, soft, hesitant, like fingers testing the keys. I don't remember grabbing the baseball bat from under my bed, but I must have, because when I stepped into my dark living room, my knuckles were white around the handle. The piano was open. I never leave it open. My breath came fast and shallow. I reached out with the bat, nudging the lid closed with a soft click. Silence. Then, right next to my ear, a whisper, out of tune. I spun, swinging wildly. Nothing, just my empty apartment, my own pulse roaring in my ears. I don't remember sleeping after that. The next morning, I drove. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. My hands ached from gripping the wheels so tightly. My head throbbed with exhaustion. I found myself back at the empty lot. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe I needed to see it in daylight, prove to myself that there was nothing there. But as I stepped out of my car, the air around me grew thick, like the atmosphere before a storm, charged and waiting. And then I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible, the sound of a piano, coming from nowhere. I read, I haven't played a piano since. I sold mine the next day. I turned down every tuning job. I started working at a hardware store instead. It doesn't pay as well, but at least the hammers don't play themselves. Sometimes, though, in the dead of night, I still hear it. 3 notes, low, dissonant, rug. The piano hasn't forgotten me. I moved across the country 3 months later. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I changed my phone number, deleted my old email, even paid cash for a new apartment. For a while, it worked. I built a life that had nothing to do with music. No piano, no tuning forks, no sheet music tucked into the corners of my room. I worked with my hands, fixing shelves, cutting lumber. The steady, predictable rhythm of hammers and saws was comforting. The nightmares never completely went away, but they faded. The whispers softened. Until last week, it was late when I got home from work, just past 11. A long day, too much lifting, too much thinking. I was bone tired. I almost didn't notice the package at my door. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, no return address. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe the wrong apartment, but then I saw my name written imprecise, even letters. My full name. No one here knew my full name. I hesitated, staring at it like it might move. Eventually, curiosity won out. I carried it inside, sat on the floor, and carefully peeled back the paper. Inside was a cassette tape. No label, no markings, just a black plastic shell and a length of brown ribbon wound tight inside. I don't own a cassette player. I hadn't seen one in years, but something in me knew if I didn't listen to it, it would find find another way. I borrowed a player from an old thrift store the next day. The woman behind the counter gave me a strange look when I asked if it worked. Not many people listen to tapes anymore, she said. I just need it for one thing, I muttered. She shrugged. Hope it's a good one. I took it home, locked my door, sat on my bed, pressed play. At first, it was static, soft, crackling, like an old record spinning in an empty room. Then the breathing started, shallow, uneven, familiar. I gripped the edges of the player so hard my fingers hurt. A single piano note rang out, low, dissonant, then another, and another. The same 3 notes, the same wrong sound, but this time there was something new. A voice, hoarse, dry, like it had been buried under the earth. He left before the tuning was finished. I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking. The room was silent, but I felt it. The pressure in the air, the weight of something watching. I turned the tape player over, pried open the back. My stomach lurched. There was no tape inside. The ribbon was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my room, every light on, clutching the cassette like it was a loaded gun. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. The piano wasn't going to stop. The notes weren't going to stop. Not until I finished the tuning. So now I'm here, back in the old city, back at the empty lot. The sky is overcast, and the wind has that same thick, electric charge. I step forward, my boots crunching against dry leaves. The air humps, and then, just for a second, I sit at the house. Oh, dark, waiting. The front door is slightly open, and inside, the piano is playing itself. Soft, beckoning, 3 notes, low, dissonant, wrong. I take a breath, step inside, and close the door behind me. There was an empty lot near my childhood home. Not abandoned, just empty. No one ever built anything on it. No for sale sign, no grass, just dirt and gravel. It wasn't fenced off, and kids would cut through it on their way home from school. I did too, plenty of times. One evening, when I was about 16, I was walking home later than usual. My route took me past the lot, and I decided to cut through it like I had 100 times before. But as soon as my foot touched the gravel, something felt. Oh, the lot wasn't empty. There was a man standing in the center. He wasn't doing anything. Just standing perfectly still. His back was to me, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing. He wasn't there when I approached. I was sure of it, but now he was. I told myself he must have come from the other side, maybe cutting through like I was. But something about him made my skin crawl. He was wearing a long coat, even though it was warm out, and his posture was too rigid, too unnatural. I decided to just keep walking like I hadn't noticed him. I took one step. He turned his head, not his body, just his head, unnaturally far, like he had no bones in his neck. I froze. His face was wrong. I don't know how else to explain it. It was like looking at someone who had learned to smile by reading about it, but had never actually seen one. His mouth was too wide, his teeth too many, his eyes too focused. I turned and walked away as fast as I could without running. My whole body screamed at me to move, but I didn't want to let him know I was scared. I kept my pace steady. Then I heard it. Gravel shifting, footsteps. I forced myself to keep going. My house wasn't far. I could make it. Just a few more blocks. The sound of footsteps behind me stopped, but I didn't dare look back. I reached my front porch, unlocked the door, and shut it behind me. My hands were shaking. I flicked on the porch light and peered through the peephole. The empty lot was empty again. I didn't take that shortcut ever again, and I never saw the man again. But sometimes, when I pass by that lot, I feel like something is watching. A few years passed, and I had almost convinced myself that it had been my imagination, a trick of the evening light, a tired brain conjuring something that wasn't there. Almost. Then, last summer, I came back to visit my parents. The town hadn't changed much, but something about it felt different, like it had been holding its breath. One night, I was driving home after meeting an old friend. My route didn't take me past the lot anymore, but I had to pass close to it. As I approached the intersection near it, my headlights swept over the lot's edge, and I saw something standing there. Not a man, not exactly. A shape, tall and still, just like before. But this time, it was facing me. I couldn't see the details, just a silhouette, something standing too perfectly still, watching. The memory of that smile, that wrongness, hit me like a punch to the gut. My hands clutched the wheel. I didn't stop. I told myself it was nothing, just some random person, a shadow, a trick of the dark. Then I got home. I parked in my parents' driveway, took a deep breath, and glanced at my rearview mirror. The lot was more than 6 blocks away, but something was standing under the street light at the end of the road. I went inside and locked every door. I didn't see it again for the rest of my visit. I even forced myself to drive past the lot during the day just to prove to myself that it was fine. It was just just a patch of gravel and dirt. Nothing strange. But on my last night in town, I had a dream. I was back in the empty lot, but this time it wasn't empty. There were no buildings, no trees, no fences, just figures. Dozens of them standing completely still, all of them facing me. Their faces were blurred, shifting, mouths stretched into two wide smiles. Then, one by one, they began to turn their heads, slow, unnatural, like cracking joints. The last one, the one closest to me, was the man from before. His mouth moved, but I don't remember hearing words. Just a sound, something low and guttural, like laughter that didn't belong in a human throat. I woke up covered in sweat, my ears ringing. I didn't go back to that town for a long time, but sometimes, when I drive through unfamiliar places, I see empty lots. And sometimes, just for a second, I think I see someone standing there, waiting, watching, and I stayed away from my hometown for years. I built a life somewhere else, far away from that lot, from the strange man, from the dream I refused to think about. But a few months ago, my mother got sick. It wasn't serious at first, but my dad called me one night and said, "You should come home, just in case." So I packed a bag and made the drive back. The moment I crossed into town, I felt it, that breathless sensation, like something had been waiting for me to return. I ignored it. I told myself it was just nostalgia mixed with nerves. I avoided the lot. I didn't even look in its direction. At least, not at first. It happened on my third night back. I was staying in my childhood bedroom, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the pipes. Then I heard it, a soft knock on my window. My stomach dropped. I froze, my body refusing to move. My bedroom was on the second floor. Another knock, deliberate, leisured. I forced myself to turn my head to look. There was nothing there, just the dark glass, reflecting my own pale face back at me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went downstairs and found my dad in the kitchen. "You alright?" he asked. I hesitated. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." He gave me a knowing look, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. I let it go. Later that day, I had to run to the pharmacy for my mom. I took the long way, intentionally avoiding the lot. But on my way back, at the last second, my hands seemed to move on their own, turning the wheel down the street I had sworn not to take. I told myself I was just looking, just checking. It was still empty, just dirt and gravel. No bed, no figures, nothing. But there were footprints in the dust, not just one set, dozens, and all of them led out of the lot. I hit the gas and didn't look back. That night, after my parents went to bed, my dad knocked on my door. "You got a minute?" he asked, stepping inside before I could answer. He sat on the edge of my bed, rubbing a hand over his face like he was trying to decide how to start. Then, after a long silence, he said, "I saw him too." I felt the blood drain from my face. "When?" I whispered. My dad exhaled. "Years ago, when we first moved here. I was out late, walking the dog, cut through the lot like everyone else did back then, and I saw him, same as you." I gripped my blanket, my knuckles white. He was just standing there. My dad continued, didn't move, didn't speak, but I swear to God, I felt him watching me even though he never turned around. I swallowed hard. "What did you do?" "I left," he said simply, and I never walked through there again. A long silence stretched between us. Then my dad said something that made my skin crawl. "You said he turned his head, right? When you saw him?" And I nodded. My dad looked down at his hands. "He never did that when I saw him." I didn't sleep that night either. I left town the next day. My mom was doing better, and I couldn't stay any longer. As I drove past the edge of town, I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror, just to be sure. The lot was empty, but standing at the very edge of the gravel, just before the sidewalk, was a figure, perfectly still, head turned toward me, mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural smile. I pressed my foot down on the gas. It started with a single paper crane. I work at a university, but not as a student or a professor. I'm just one of the people who keep things running in the background. My job is mostly quiet, handling inventory and deliveries, making sure equipment gets where it needs to go. It's a job that doesn't usually invite attention, but someone was paying attention to me. The first time I noticed the crane, it was sitting on my desk in the supply room, a perfectly folded piece of white paper, no note, no explanation. I assumed it was a joke or something left behind by a coworker, so I just tossed it in the trash. The next day, there were two cranes. They were balanced on top of a box of printer paper, identical in their precision. Something about them unsettled me. I asked around, but no one claimed that maybe one of the students. My manager suggested they wander in here sometimes. By the end of the week, there were 7, always perfectly folded, always placed where I would find them. That's when I started checking the cameras. The supply room has a security camera facing the door. It's mostly there in case anything gets stolen, but it should have caught whoever was leaving these things. I sat down around in the security office and scrolled through the footage from the past few nights, and that's when I saw him. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the door to the supply room opened, though no one had swiped a key card. A man walked in, tall, wearing an old-fashioned coat that reached down to his ankles. His face was just rugged, blurred, like the camera couldn't quite capture it. He walked straight to my desk, pulled something from his pocket, and carefully placed it down. A paper crane. Then he turned, walked out, and the door shut behind him. No hesitation, no wondering, like he had done this 100 times before. I checked the logs. No one was supposed to have been in the building at that hour. I asked security if they recognized him, but the footage wouldn't play properly when I tried to show them. The file just glitched. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's blurred face. The next morning, I arrived at work early, dreading what I might find. This time, there weren't just paper cranes. Spread across my desk were dozens of origami figures, birds, stars, flowers, things I didn't even recognize. And in the center was a folded note. My hands were shaking as I opened it. "You're not supposed to be here. I don't work at the university anymore. I don't even live in the same city. And if I ever see another paper crane, I'm burning it before I open it." I wish I could say that was the end of it. That leaving the city, changing jobs, and cutting ties with that university was enough. But I think, deep down, I knew that wouldn't be the case. It took months before I stopped jumping at shadows. I moved across the state, found a new place, and took a job at a small logistics company. Nothing special, just moving inventory, much like before. No cameras, no security rooms, no late night university buildings. I kept my head down and my routine predictable. I told myself I was safe, and I was, for a while. Then, one morning, I found it, a single paper crane. It was sitting in the cup holder of my car. I hadn't noticed it when I got in, just threw my coffee in the console and started driving. It wasn't until I hit a red light and reached down for a sip that my fingers brushed something smooth and stiff. My stomach dropped. I didn't unfold it. I didn't want to know what was inside. I threw it out of the window and tried to convince myself it was nothing, just some random, meaningless coincidence. But it wasn't. That night, I locked my doors, checked my windows, and forced myself to sleep. No more paranoia, I told myself. No more looking over my shoulder. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I woke up, not because of a noise, not because of a dream. I woke up because I felt something. The air in the room was heavy, like I wasn't alone. My bedroom was dark except for the blinking light of my alarm clock, glowing red against the shadows. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, from the foot of my bed, I heard it, a soft, papery rustling, like the whisper of 100 tiny wings. I don't remember moving, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was running. I barely registered the cold floor beneath my feet, the harsh slam of the front door as I threw myself outside. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, engine roaring to life, tires screeching as I tore out of the driveway. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I couldn't go back. When the sun finally rose, I pulled over in a gas station parking lot, hands clenched around the steering wheel. I forced myself to look at the back seat. It was empty. I let out a shuddering breath. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had just panicked. But then I glanced at the passenger seat. A single, perfectly folded paper crane sat there, and beneath it, another note. This time, I read it. "You can't leave. I don't know what to do. I haven't been back to my apartment. Haven't even been back to that city. I've been living out of motels, never staying anywhere longer than a few nights. But it doesn't matter, because wherever I go, I always wake up at 3:13 a.m., and the cranes always find me. I wish I could say I had a plan, that I knew what I was running from or how to stop it, but the truth is, I don't. I've been on the move for weeks now, switching motels, paying in cash, leaving no paper trail. I even ditched my phone, thinking maybe I was being tracked. It didn't make a difference, because every single night, no matter where I go, I wake up at exactly 3:13 a.m., and there's always a crane. Sometimes, I find it on the nightstand beside my bed. Sometimes, it's on the dashboard of my car. One time, I woke up and felt something crinkle under my hand. It was in my bed with me. I tried destroying them. I burned one in a motel sink, watched the flames curl around its delicate edges until it was nothing but ash. The next morning, it was back, sitting in the same spot I had found it, pristine and untouched. I stopped trying after that. But last night was different. I was holed up at a roadside motel off the interstate, some no-name place that smelled like mildew and desperation. I had double locked the door, blocked it with a chair, and left the bathroom light on because darkness felt too much like an invitation. But at 3:13 a.m., I woke up anyway. At first, I thought it was just another night, another crane waiting for me in some quiet, patient spot. But then I noticed something. The air felt different, thicker, like something else was in the room with me. I turned my head slowly, heart pounding, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I didn't run. I couldn't, because in the corner of the room, half hidden in the dim glow of the bathroom light, he was standing there, the man with the paper birds. He was taller than I remembered, his long coat draping around him like a second darkened skin, and his face. His face was still wrong, blurred, shifting, like the edges of an unfinished sketch. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched me, and in his hands, he held something, not a crate this time, a note. My mouth was dry, my hands gripping the sheets so tightly my knuckles ached. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was stare as he tilted his head, his fingers releasing the note. It drifted down to the carpet like a dead leaf, and then he was gone, just gone, like he had never been there at all. I didn't move for a long time and just lay there, listening to the silence, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. Finally, with shaking hands, I reached down and picked up the note. It was different from the others. Not cleaned, not perfect. The edges were frayed, the paper slightly yellowed, like it had been handled too many times before, and the message wasn't typed. It was handwritten. Stop running, come back. I don't know what it means. I don't know what happens if I listen, but I think I'm running out of choices, and I know that if I don't go back soon, he's going to take me there himself. This happened a few years ago when I was working at a large convention center. I was just a part-time staffer, mostly handling attendee check-ins, lost badges, and general guest services. The place was massive, long, echoing halls, labyrinthine service corridors, and a general sense of being too big for the number of people actually working there. Most nights, by the time my shift ended, the main halls would be empty. The janitorial staff worked late, but they mostly stuck to the exhibition floors and food courts. My last task before heading out was always checking the lost and found desk located in a glass-walled room near the main entrance. People lost things constantly, keys, wallets, entire bags sometimes. It was my job to log them in before security took over for the night. One evening, after a particularly chaotic event, I stayed late to sort through a pile of lost items. I was alone in the glass room, scanning ID cards and cataloging forgotten scarves when I noticed movement outside. A man was standing just beyond the entrance to the lost and found area, staring in at me. At first, I assumed he was a latecomer looking for something he'd lost, so I gave him the standard polite nod. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just stood there. Something about him unsettled me immediately. He wasn't disheveled or obviously dangerous, but there was an uncanny stillness to him, like he wasn't quite sure how to imitate human behavior. He was tall, wearing a neatly pressed gray coat, and his hands were clasped in front of him. His eyes were just too focused. I swallowed my unease and forced a smile. Hi there, are you looking for something? Nothing, just staring. I tried again. Sir, do you need help? Slowly, he lifted one hand and pointed not at the lost items, but at my desk. Now I was getting genuinely freaked out. I looked down at my desk, half expecting to see something unusual, just the usual pile of phones, wallets, and forgotten lanyards. When I looked back up, he was closer, not by much, but enough that I knew he hadn't walked normally. I hadn't looked away for more than a second, but there he was, just a few steps from the glass wall now. His expression hadn't changed. Something inside me screamed to leave. I stood up, trying to act casual, lost, and found his clothes for the night. I said, inching toward the exit, if you come back tomorrow. Then he moved, not walked, moved, like a skipping frame in a broken video. He was subtly inches from the glass, face nearly pressed against it. I stumbled backward, hard hammering. He was still pointing at my desk, but his head had tilted slightly like he was listening for something. And then I heard it, a small tap, not from the man, but from the pile of lost items. I whipped around. Nothing looked out of place, except for a single key that had shifted slightly as if it had just been placed there. The second I looked away, I felt the air change. I turned back, and he was inside the room. No sound, no movement, just inside. I read. I don't even remember making the decision. I was just suddenly in the hallway, sprinting toward the security office. I didn't stop until I reached one of the night guards. Of course, when they checked lost and found, the room was empty. The cameras glitched. That's what the security guy told me. Just a second of static during the exact moment I left my desk. Nothing was stolen, nothing was out of place, except for that key. I checked the logs later, though what had turned it in, it hadn't been in the pile when I started sorting. I wish I could say that was the last time I saw him. After that night, I refused to take late shifts. I didn't tell my boss the real reason, just blamed my college workload. A few coworkers joked that I just wanted to dodge the boring end of night routine, but I didn't care. As long as I could avoid being alone in that glass-walled room, I was fine. For a while, nothing happened. No strange encounters, no missing time, no misplaced keys. I convinced myself that maybe I had just been tired, stressed, imagining imagining things. But then, the security guard who checked the cameras that night, he quit. No warning, no 2-week notice. Just stopped showing up. I only found out because another employee mentioned it in passing. Yeah, he called out sick for a week, and then his supervisor said he wasn't coming back. Real weird. I wanted to ask more, but I was afraid of sounding paranoid. Then one day, while I was working a mid-afternoon shift, I found something strange. It was an envelope. No name, no postage, just sitting under my keyboard like someone had carefully slid it there. Inside was a photograph. It showed the lost and found room, the same glass walls, the same cluttered desk, but something was off. I looked closer, my stomach dropping. It was a picture of me, sitting at the desk, sorting through lost items. I had never seen this photo before, never posed for it, but there I was, in the exact same chair, wearing the exact same sweater I had worn on the night of the man in the gray coat. The timestamp in the bottom corner, it was from 2 nights ago. I hadn't worked that shift. I hadn't been in the lost and found room 2 nights ago. I flipped the photo over with shaking hands. Written in neat, looping handwriting were 4 words. You forgot the key. I slammed the envelope shut, shoved it deep into my bag, and forced myself to act normal for the rest of my shift. That night, when I got home, I checked my backpack where I had stuffed the photo. It was gone. I tore my room apart. I emptied my bag, my pockets, my jacket. Nothing. The envelope had vanished. But the next day, when I arrived at work, the key was back. It sat neatly on my desk and lost and found, as if it had never left. No one knew where it had come from. No one had locked it in. And when I touched it, for just a second, I thought I saw a reflection in the glass wall. A tall man in a gray coat. I should have quit right then and there. I told myself I would. That night, after seeing the key back on my desk, I swore I'd walk out, block the number of my supervisor, and never step foot in that convention center again. But I didn't. Something about the key, it was like it had anchored me there. Like the moment I touched it, something deep inside whispered, "You're not done yet." I should have ignored it, but I didn't. Instead, I did something incredibly stupid. I took the key home. The key wasn't anything special to look at. It was small, brass, oiled, no brand, no engraving, just a single worn tooth like it had been used 1,000 times before. But the moment it sat in my pocket, I felt heavier, like I had agreed to something I didn't understand. Still, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. I tossed it onto my nightstand and tried to sleep. At exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke up, not in a slow, groggy way. No, I was suddenly, sharply aware, heart racing, skin crawling, like something had just shifted in the air around me. The key was gone. My breath caught. I had left it right there before falling asleep. Then I heard it, a soft tap from inside my closet. I didn't move. Another tap. Then, slowly, the sound of breathing. Not my own, shallow, deliberate, just beyond the door. I lay there, frozen, staring at my closet. My bedroom was small. There was no way someone could be in there without me noticing. But the breathing continued, slow and rhythmic, like whoever or whatever it was knew I was awake. I don't know how long I stayed like that, barely breathing, barely thinking. But then, click, the sound of a key turning in a lock. Not from my front door, not from my window, from inside my closet. And then silence. No breathing, no movement. Just the hollow, waiting silence of something that wasn't finished yet. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I should have gotten rid of it, should have thrown it into a sewer, burned it, buried it. But I didn't, because when I finally gathered the nerve to check my closet the next morning, the key was sitting neatly on the floor, like it had returned itself, like it was waiting. And worse, there were footprints, faint, dusty imprints on my floorboards, leading from my closet to my bed. Standing there, heart hammering in my chest, I made a decision. I had to go back to the lost and found desk. I had to return the key. That evening, I walked back into the convention center for what I told myself would be the last time. The building was mostly empty, just a few janitors finishing up. I told the front desk I'd left something in the lost and found room, then made my way there, my pulse steady but my skin crawly. The glass-walled room looked the same, but as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was thick, heavy, charged. I walked to my desk, placed the key down carefully, and whispered, "I'm done." And for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft tap from behind me. I turned slowly. He was there, the man in the gray coat, standing just outside the glass wall, hands clasped, watching. But this time, something was different. He wasn't pointing at my desk. He was pointing at the chair, at the exact seat where I always sat. The realization hit me like ice in my veins. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting for me to sit, for me to take my place, for me to become the next one. I didn't think, didn't breathe. I ran, didn't stop until I was outside in the freezing night air, gasping, heart in my throat. I didn't look back. I never stepped inside that convention center again. It's been months. I moved to another city, started a new job. I've done everything I could to put that night behind me. But last week, I got a package package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single item, a cut, and a small note written in neat, looping handwriting. You left something behind. I work as a substitute teacher, which means I spend most of my days floating between schools, filling in for absent staff. It's a job that's easy enough, mostly just keeping kids in line and making sure they don't set anything on fire. A few weeks ago, I was assigned to a small middle school in a quiet town. I had never been there before, but everything seemed normal. Long hallways, outdated motivational posters, that faint smell of industrial cleaner and preteen body spray. It was just another gig. The day was uneventful until the last period. That's when the lockdown drill started. Now, I've been through plenty of these. Everyone gets up, moves to the designated safe spot, lights off, doors locked, simple. But this one was different. The announcement came over the intercom, but something was off about the voice. It was distorted, like someone was speaking too close to the microphone. It didn't sound like the principal. Lockdown, this is not a drill. My stomach dropped. The students immediately got quiet, their usual giggles and groans disappearing as they hurried to the corner of the classroom, away from the door. I followed protocol, locking the door and switching off the lights. The room was silent except for the sound of a girl quietly crying. Then we waited. Lockdowns usually end with another announcement from the principal or a knock from security. But after 10 minutes, there was nothing. 15 minutes, 20. One of the kids, a boy near the back, whispered, "Shouldn't we be getting an all clear?" He was right. This was taking too long. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving down the hall. Someone was out there. I pressed my ear against the door, barely breathing. Whoever it was wasn't in a hurry. They were just walking, pacing, occasionally stopping, and then a knock, soft and almost polite. I felt the students tense behind me. Another knock. Then the handle turned. I had locked it, but my heart pounded as I watched it jiggle. Someone was testing the door. A long silence followed, and then the whispering started. I couldn't make out words. It was faint, like someone muttering just below their breath, but it wasn't coming from one person. It was coming from multiple. I turned, mouthing "stay quiet" to the kids, who were huddled together in the dark. The whispering grew, overlapping voices murmuring from outside the door, the hall, maybe even other classrooms. Then the intercom crackled again. The same distorted voice. Lockdown lifted. You may exit your classrooms. No way. Something was very wrong. I didn't move. The kids didn't move. More footsteps. More whispers. Then I heard a door down the hall opened. Someone had believed the announcement. A shuffle. A gasp. Then silence. No screams. No running. Just nothing. I stayed in that classroom for over an hour, ignoring the next 3 announcements telling us the lockdown was over. Eventually, the real principal's voice came through. This time, it sounded real. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty, but something had changed. The school felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Later, I found out that another teacher had opened their door too soon. They never found him. There was no intruder, no reports, no explanation. I never went back to that school. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, that I left the school, shook it off as an overactive imagination, and moved on. But I didn't, because whatever happened in that school, whatever thing was outside my door that day, didn't stay there. A few weeks later, I was at another school, a different district altogether. It was a high school this time, bigger, noisier. I had almost convinced myself that what happened before was just a bizarre, unexplainable fluke, until it happened again. The day had been normal, students half listening, phones hidden under desks, the usual. Then, right before the final bell, the intercom crackled to light. Lockdown, this is not a drill. My body went cold. The same voice, that warped, too close to the mic voice. I scanned the students' faces. Most of them looked bored, some confused. None of them knew. None of them had heard it before. But I had. I forced myself to move, locking the door, turning off the lights. The students, though reluctant, followed instructions, but my hands were shaking. I didn't know if it was fear or adrenaline. Minutes passed. No sirens. No security knocking on doors. Then came the footsteps. They were faster this time, not the slow, deliberate pacing from before. More urgent, more erratic. Thump, thump, thump. The running stopped right outside my door. I bit down on my lip so hard I tasted blood. The students were still, some holding their breath. Then, thunk, louder than before. Harder. I clenched my fists, pressing my back against the desk. The handle twitched, turned, still locked. But I swear, it felt like something was pushing against the door from the other side. Not like a person trying to break in, but something else. Like a presence, an unseen weight pressing against the barrier between us. Then came the whispering, not from the door, door from inside the room. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked over a chair. The students were frozen, eyes wide. The whispering came from the air itself, like a breath behind my ear, curling around the room, settling into every shadowed corner. I don't know how long it lasted. Time stretched, bent. Then, just like before, lockdown lifted. You may exit your classrooms. But this time, I saw something, a shadow, just outside the window of the classroom door, standing motionless. I could barely make out the shape, a distortion like heat rising from pavement. It was watching. I knew better than to open the door. I waited, an hour, then another. Finally, a second announcement came, this time in the real principal's voice. When I finally stepped outside, the hallway was silent. No students, no teachers. Then I saw the locker, just one. Its door was hanging open, and inside, scrawled into the metal with deep, jagged marks, was a message. A message for me. You listened. Good. That was the last time I took a teaching job. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants, but I have a feeling it isn't done with me yet. I quit teaching after that. It wasn't just paranoia. I could feel something following me. It didn't matter how far I moved, what I did, or how much I tried to rationalize it. I could feel it in places it had no right to be. In the grocery store, where the overhead speakers crackled with a static-drenched whisper just for a second. At home, where my TV would flicker to a blank channel, and I'd swear I saw movement just before it cut back to normal. On the street, where I'd hear footsteps stop just as I did, only to turn and find nothing there. But the worst came when I took a job at a bookstore. It was supposed to be safe, quiet, no more classrooms, no more intercoms, just books and customers who barely talked to me. And for a while, it was, until one night, it was near closing. I was alone, shelving the last of the returns. The place was dim, filled with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. Then, just as I was locking up, the intercom came on and I froze. Lockdown. This is not a drill. No, not here. My breath hitched. The store didn't even have an intercom. The lights flickered, the speakers hissed. Then, the footsteps, not from the front, from the back room, the stock room, where no one should have been. I moved slowly, my fingers gripping the key so hard it dug into my palm. I needed to leave. I needed to get out right now. But as I turned to run, I heard it. Look. From inside the stock room, the door was slightly ajar, and the whispering, it filled the air, curling around me like unseen fingers. My vision blurred, my body locking up with an instinct I didn't understand, like prey caught in a trap. I turned my head. There, beyond the crack in the stockroom door, the shadow, twisted, rug. It didn't move. It didn't breathe, but I knew it was looking at me. And then, clear as day, as if someone was whispering directly into my ear. You ascended. Good. I read. I don't remember getting home. I don't remember locking my doors, pulling my curtains shut, or turning every single light on. I just remember sitting on the floor of my apartment, shaking as my phone buzzed with a notification. An email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject, no body, just an attachment, an audio file. I shouldn't have played it, but I did. The recording was short, only a few seconds long. A burst of static, a distant, distorted voice. And then, look. I threw my phone across the room. I haven't gone back to work. I barely leave my apartment, but sometimes, late at night, when everything is still, my speakers crackle. I used to work at a small, independent art gallery downtown. It wasn't much, just 3 rooms and a storage area in the back, but it had a certain charm, the kind of place where local artists could showcase their work without the red tape of big museums. It was quiet most days, except for the occasional visitor or a school tour. One afternoon, I was alone at the front desk, scrolling through my phone when I heard the front door chime. I glanced up, expecting a usual guest, a tourist or art student, but instead, a man stepped inside. He was off. I can't describe it better than that. Something about the way he moved, too deliberate, too careful. He wore a dark green jacket, zipped up despite the warm weather, and a beanie pulled low over his forehead. His face was expressionless, his eyes scanning the room with slow, unsettling precision. Welcome in, I said, my voice a little tighter than usual. He didn't reply. He just walked past me into the first exhibit, hands in his pockets. I watched him for a moment, then forced myself to focus on my computer. At first, everything seemed normal. He moved through the exhibit slowly, pausing at each piece a little longer than most people would. 5 minutes passed, 10, then 20. I glanced at the clock, growing uneasy. No one else had come in, and he hadn't made a sound. At the 30-minute mark, I cleared my throat. Let me know if you have any questions, I said, forcing a smile. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. Just kept staring at a painting, a dark, abstract piece with heavy brush strokes. The air in the gallery felt heavier. I checked my phone, pretending to be busy, but my heart was pounding. Something told me not to take my eyes off him for too long. Then, after what felt like forever, he finally moved again. He turned, slow, mechanical, and walked to the next room. I exhaled. Maybe he was just eccentric. Maybe I was overreacting. But then I noticed something strange. The painting he'd been staring at, it was slightly tilted. I frowned. All of our artwork was carefully secured to the walls. How had it moved? I stood, went over, and gently adjusted it back into place. When I turned back toward the entrance of the next room, he was standing there, watching me. I froze. He hadn't made a sound. No footsteps. Nothing. I just had to fix something. I stammered, my throat dry. Again, no response. Just that blank, unblinking stare. Then he smiled. It was the worst part. That slow, stretching grin that didn't reach his eyes. Like he just figured something out. And then he walked past me, so close our sleeves nearly brushed. I held my breath. He left without another word. The door chimed. The gallery was empty again. I let out a shaking breath, my skin crawling. I went to the back room, pretending to reorganize supplies, anything to shake the lingering unease. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I finally convinced myself I was being paranoid and returned to the front desk. And that's when I saw it. The same painting, the one he had been staring at, was tilted again. I had been alone the whole time. No one else had come in, but the painting had moved. And in the reflection of the gallery's front window, just before I locked up for the night, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The man was across the street, watching, waiting, like he'd never left. I don't know how long he stood there, watching me from across the street. I refused to look for too long, afraid that if I acknowledged him, it would somehow make it worse. Instead, I forced my shaking hands to finish locking up the gallery. The moment the deadbolt clicked, I turned off the lights and hurried to the back exit. I didn't want to walk out the front door, didn't want to risk passing him on the sidewalk. My car was parked a block away, and I told myself if I just got there fast enough, I could forget all about this. But when I stepped into the alley behind the gallery, I knew something was wrong. It was too quiet. The city wasn't exactly bustling at this hour, but there were always some noises, distant car horns, chatter from a bar down the street. But now, it felt like the entire block had gone silent. I swallowed hard and started walking. I was halfway to my car when I heard the footsteps. Soft and deliberate, not rushing, not running, just follow me, and I didn't dare look back. I fumbled at my purse for my keys, my fingers numb with panic. The footsteps kept pace with me, matching every step I took. I reached my car and yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. For a second, I sat there, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I glanced up at the rearview mirror. Nothing. The alley was empty. I exhaled shakily and locked the doors, just in case. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I'd scared myself so much that my mind was playing tricks on me. I started the engine and peeled out of the alley, not stopping until I was miles away from the gallery. That night, I barely slept. Every shadow outside my window made my skin crawl. Every creak in my apartment sent my heart into my throat. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I got to the gallery early to open up. My hands were still shaking as I unlocked the door. At first, everything looked normal, until I stepped inside. Every single painting in the gallery had been tilted, not just the one he had been staring at. All of them. I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The air was thick, heavy, like someone had just been there. The security system hadn't gone off. The doors were locked when I arrived. No alarms, no broken windows, but someone had been inside. And then I saw it, a single handprint smudged against the glass of the front door, pressed low, near the bottom, like someone had crouched there, watching, waiting. I left. I called my boss and told her I quit. I never went back to that gallery again. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted, but I do know one thing. He was never going to leave. I moved on, or at least, I tried to. After quitting the gallery, I got a new job at a design firm across town. It was a welcome change. Bright offices, co-workers, constant noise. No eerie silence. No strange visitors. No tilted paintings. For a while, things were normal again, until they weren't. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. It would hit me at random moments, walking to my car after work, standing in line at a coffee shop, sitting in my apartment late at night. At first, I told myself it was just paranoia. I had spent so much time looking over my shoulder after the gallery incident that I was imagining things. But then, I started seeing him again, not up close, not at my door, just there, at the far end of a grocery aisle, standing at the opposite platform of the subway, unmoving as trains screamed past. A dark figure lingering across the street when I left work, always half-shadowed, always just out of reach. The worst part, he never tried to approach me. He didn't need to, because no matter where I went, no matter how much I told myself it wasn't possible, he always found me. Not texts, not calls, just little things. One morning, I found a folded napkin on my desk at work. I almost threw it away without looking, but something made me pause. There was something written on it in shaky, scrawling ink. "Did you miss me?" I stared at it for a long time. My coworkers bustled around me, chatting, laughing, unaware that my entire world had just caved in. I looked around, searching for anyone watching. No one was, or at least, no one I could see. I threw the napkin away, convincing myself it was a prank. But deep down, I knew better. Not in a gallery, not at work, at home. It was subtle at first, just 1 or 2 frames slightly crooked when I got back from work. I assumed I had bumped them, or maybe a draft had shifted them. But then it got worse. One night, I came home to find every single piece of artwork in my apartment tilted at the exact same angle. Every single one. I barely slept that night. I wanted to call someone, my parents, the police, anyone, but what would I even say? That someone kept tilting my paintings, that I was being followed by a man who never spoke, never touched me, never did anything but watch, that I wasn't even sure if he was real anymore. I had convinced myself that I was overreacting, that if I ignored it, if I refused to acknowledge him, he would go away. So when my best friend invited me over for a movie night, I said yes. I needed a break, needed to feel normal again. We ordered food, picked a dumb comedy, and for the first time in months, I felt okay, until I got up to use the bathroom. Her apartment was small, just a short hallway leading to the bedroom and bath, but as I passed the front door, something made me pause. A whisper of movement from the other side, a shuffle, a breath. I froze, and then a single piece of paper slid under the door. My hand shook as I bent down, hard hammering against my ribs. The paper was blank, except for 3 words, scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. I found you. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember my friend running over, demanding to know what was wrong. I don't remember anything except the sheer, paralyzing terror that he was here. That no matter where I went, no matter how many locks I changed, no matter how much I tried to run, he would always find me. That night, I packed a bag and left town. I don't know where I'm going yet. I don't know if it'll be enough, but I do know one thing. He's still out there, and he's not done yet. I was 6 the first time I saw the playground. It was tucked behind an old community center, the kind of place that held yoga classes for retirees and weekend craft fairs. My mom used to go there for pottery lessons, and while she worked, I played outside. The playground wasn't much, just a rusted slide, a set of swings, and a wooden playhouse with peeling blue paint. But it was mine. No one else ever played there. I never saw other kids, and the adults rarely even glanced at it, except for one. She wasn't an employee or a visitor. I don't know who she was, but every time I played, she was watching. At first, I thought she was just another mom waiting for a class to end, but she never went inside. She would sit on the farthest bench, hands folded in her lap, watching me in complete stillness. She never waved, never smiled. I don't remember her blinking. One day, I asked my mom about her. "What woman?" she asked, packing up her pottery. "The one who watches me play." Mom's expression tightened. "There's no one there, honey." I wanted to argue, but something in her tone stopped me. The next time I went outside, I looked straight at the woman. She was there, same as always. But when I turned back to the building, I caught a glimpse of my mom through the window. She was watching me stand alone in an empty playground. I stopped playing outside after that. Years later, after we moved away, I asked my mom again. She sighed, rubbing her temple. "That playground was closed, sweetheart. Has been for decades." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "Then why'd you let me play there?" She didn't laugh. I didn't think about the playground for a long time. Life moved on, as it does. I grew up, went to college, got a job. I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a kid's overactive imagination, twisting a memory into something eerie. Then last year, I had to drive through my old hometown for work. It wasn't planned. I was rerouted because of construction, and before I realized it, I was turning down familiar streets. The community center was still there, though the paint was more faded, the sign half fallen, and behind it, the playground. It looked exactly the same. Same rusted slide, same peeling blue playhouse, like it had been frozen in time. There was no way it had been left untouched for 20 years. Playgrounds get removed, renovated, replaced, but this one, it just sat there, untouched, forgotten. A strange urge crept over me. I pulled into the cracked parking lot, turned off my car. I wasn't sure what I was doing, what I was looking for. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that it was real, that it wasn't real. I walked toward the playground, boots crunching on dead leaves. The air felt too still. No birds, no wind, no distant hum of traffic, just the sound of my own footsteps. Then I saw her. She was sitting on the farthest bench, hands folded, still, exactly as I remembered. Her face was wrong, not aged, not changed, just wrong. Her eyes locked onto mine immediately, as if she had been waiting. And despite everything in my body screaming at me to run, I stepped closer. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice too loud in the silence. She tilted her head. Not a single muscle moved in the rest of her face. I don't know why that was the worst part, but it was. My stomach twisted. This was wrong. This was wrong. I turned back to my car, my legs suddenly sluggish, like I was moving through water. I forced myself to keep walking, gripping my keys so tightly they bit into my palm. I was almost at the car when I heard it. A whisper, soft, almost gentle. You grew up. I didn't turn around. I threw myself into the driver's seat, started the car with shaking hands. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I made the mistake of glancing in the rearview mirror. She was standing now, in the middle of the playground, still watching. I don't know what that playground is. I don't know who or what she is, but I do know one thing. She's still waiting. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept looping through the encounter, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I was remembering things wrong. Maybe the woman was just some local, someone who happened to be there both in my childhood and now. A coincidence, but I knew better. And yet, a part of me, some deep, unsettled part, needed to know more. So I did something stupid. I went looking for answers. The next morning, I called my mom. I told her I had driven past the old community center, that I had seen the playground again. She went quiet for a long moment. Then, in a careful voice, she asked, "Did you go near it?" I hesitated. No. A sharp breath. Good. That should have been the end of it. I should have let it go. But I didn't. A few days later, I found myself at the local records office. I wanted to see if I could find anything about the playground, when it was built, why it was never renovated. It didn't exist. There were plenty of records on the community center, its construction, its expansions over the years, but no mention of a playground. No blueprints, no permits, no maintenance logs. Nothing. I asked the clerk, an older woman who had been working there for decades, if she knew anything about it. Her face darkened immediately. There's no playground behind that building. I started to argue, but she shook her head, her expression tight. Whatever you think you saw, whatever you remember, forget it. It's not a place for you. The way she said it sent a chill up my spine. Not a place for children, not a place for the public, a place for me. I left in a hurry, my skin crawling. I tried to put it behind me. I really did. But the dream started soon after. I was back at the playground, alone. The air was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, and she was there, not sitting this time, standing over me, her face still locked in that unnatural stillness, watching, waiting. I would wake up gasping for breath, my sheets damp with sweat. The worst part, the dreams were getting clearer, closer. She was no longer at a distance. She was standing just a few feet away, then an arm's length. Then I stopped sleeping, stopped looking at mirrors, at reflections in glass. Every time I did, I expected to see her behind me. And then last night, I woke up, but I wasn't in bed. I was standing in my apartment doorway, keys in my hand, as if I had been about to leave, as if something had called me. My phone buzzed on the counter, a text from an unknown number. 4 words, "You remember me now. I'm leaving town today." I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if she can follow me. I just know I can't stay. And if you ever find yourself in my hometown, if you ever drive past that crumbling community center, don't stop, don't look, don't go near the playground. I work at a railway maintenance yard, not the kind with gleaming passenger trains, but the kind where old, rusted freight cars go to die. It's a lonely job, especially during the night shift. Most of my coworkers prefer the daylight hours, but I like the quiet. It was just me, the tracks, and the occasional distant horn from a train passing through. There's an old office building on site, mostly abandoned except for a break room and a few storage closets. At the very top of the building, mounted on a skeletal tower of rusted beams, is a clock. The train yard clock, as we call it. No one really knows who maintains it. It doesn't work, at least not correctly. The hands never move the way they should. Some nights, it's frozen at 3:47. Other times, it'll skip ahead or lag behind, never aligning with reality. And sometimes, it moves backward, ticking with unnatural precision. Everyone on the night shift knows not to look at the clock too long. I thought it was just an old piece of railway superstition, until one night when my radio crackled with static, and a voice, my own voice, whispered through the speaker, "Don't look at the clock." I froze, my fingers tightening around the radio. My heart hammered against my ribs as the voice repeated itself. It was May. Same tone, same rasp I got after long shifts. Then silence. I turned slowly, feeling the cold grip of unease coil around my spine. Against my better judgment, I looked up at the clock. It was moving, not smoothly, but in jittery, unnatural leaps. The second hand flickered back and forth between numbers like a glitching video. The hour hand twitched backward in slow, uneven motions. And then, I swear this is true, the numbers themselves seemed to shift, like they were rearranging. That's when I saw something behind the glass. A shape, a figure. It was watching me, not from behind the tower, but inside the clock. The clock glass was fogged and grimy, but I could see the vague outline of a face. It wasn't moving, it wasn't breathing, it was just there. And then the minute hand shuddered forward and the thing inside the clock tilted its head. I ran. I don't remember making it back to my car, but I must have because I peeled out of that lot, leaving behind my gear, my radio, everything. I didn't even go back to pick up my paycheck. A few weeks later, I heard the maintenance yard got shut down. Something about the tower collapsing unexpectedly. No one was hurt. There was no one left working the night shift after I quit. I don't know if what I saw that night was real or if exhaustion played tricks on me, but sometimes when I pass by abandoned train yards, I catch myself looking for a broken clock, and I never ever let myself stare too long. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I moved on, found another job, and never thought about that cursed clock again. But the truth is, I never really left it behind. The nightmares started a few weeks after I quit. They were dramatic, no shadowy figures chasing me, no monstrous hands grabbing from the dark. Just a simple, relentless dream. I was standing in the train yard, staring up at the clock. The numbers on its face would shift, slowly, deliberately. I could never make out what they were trying to say, but I knew deep down that it was meant for me. Sometimes the glass would fog up. Sometimes I'd see a shape inside, and then I started waking up at 3:47 a.m. every night. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe my body had just fallen into a weird sleep cycle, but then things started to go wrong. One night, my bedside alarm clock glitched. I woke up to see the numbers flickering, scrambly like the ones on the train yard clock. I threw it across the room, but even after it hit the wall, the red LED display kept shifting. Another time, I was walking home late from a bar when I passed a construction site. The crane stood idle against the dark sky, its metal beams forming a crude shape that looked too much like the clock tower. As I turned away, I swore I saw movement, something behind the half-finished building's windows. A shape, a figure, watching me. It got worse. Street lights would flicker as I walked past. My phone would vibrate at random times, only to show a blank notification with the timestamp 3:47. One night, I was driving home when my car radio turned on by itself. Static, then a voice, my voice whispering, "Don't look at the clock." I nearly crashed. I stopped sleeping. I stopped going out after dark. Every time I glanced at a clock, I felt my stomach drop, terrified I'd see the wrong numbers. Then, the final straw. The package arrived at my apartment. No return address, no postage, just a small, battered cardboard box. Inside, wrapped in yellow newspaper, was a clock, an old pocket watch, its glass cracked, its hands frozen at 3:47. I threw it away. The next morning, it was back on my nightstand. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm being counted down. And the worst part, I'm starting to see reflections in the glass. I left my apartment that night. No plan, no destination, just raw animal fear telling me to get out. I drove for hours, stopping only when exhaustion forced me to pull into a roadside motel. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and curled up on the bed, my heart still hammering. I didn't sleep. At 3:47 a.m., my phone screen lit up. No call, no text, just the clock widget changing by itself. I turned the phone off. The motel's bedside alarm clock flickered. The numbers scrambled, shifting, rearranging, like they were trying to spell something out. And then the second hand started ticking backward. That's when I heard the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my motel door. I sat frozen, gripping the sheets. Every muscle in my body screamed at me not to answer. Then the knock came again, louder, more insistent. I don't know where I found the courage, but I forced myself to move. I crept toward the peephole, barely breathing, my pulse roaring in my ears. I shouldn't have looked. There was no one outside, just darkness, empty, endless darkness. The parking lot, the street beyond it, all swallowed by a void blacker than any night sky. The motel's neon sign wasn't glowing. The cars in the lot were gone. The world had disappeared, except for the clock tower. It was there, right outside my door. The rusted beams, the cracked face, the jittering, flickering hands, and the figure inside. It was clearer now. The fog glass only barely obscured its features. Its face, my face, stared back at me. Then the glass shattered. I woke up screaming. I was still in the motel, still gripping the sheets, still alive. The world outside was normal, cars, streetlights, the motel sign buzzing faintly. But on the nightstand beside me, the motel alarm clock read 3:47 a.m. I left immediately. I don't know what it wants. I don't know why it's following me, but I do know this. Every clock I pass now feels drug. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I see the hand stutter, shudder, moving backward when they shouldn't. Sometimes I hear faint, rhythmic ticking, even when there's no clock nearby. And sometimes, in reflections, windows, glass doors, mirrors, I catch glimpses of a figure, watching, waited. And worst of all, a few nights ago, I woke up in my bed to the sound of ticking. I turned my head, and there, sitting on my nightstand, was the pocket watch. The glass was no longer cracked, and the hands were moving again, backward. I work the late shift at a hospital, meaning I usually get off around 2 or 3 a.m. most nights. My drive home is uneventful, just dark roads, the occasional deer, and a quiet house waiting for me. But there's one stretch of my commute that always makes me uneasy. It's an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, one of those sprawly places with massive, crumbling gravestones and iron gates that are always locked at dusk. I usually don't pay it much mind, but about a month ago, something changed. The first time, I barely noticed him, just a figure standing by the entrance as I drove past. It was raining that night, so I figured it was just some unlucky guy caught in the storm. But when I glanced in my rearview mirror, he was gone. The next night, he was there again. This time, he was standing directly in front of the gate, hands at his sides, facing the road. I didn't get a good look at his face, but something about the way he stood, so rigid, so still, made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe some guy visiting a grave after hours, lost in thought. But by the fourth night, I knew something was wrong. That night, he was closer to the road, just standing there, staring at passing cars. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look directly at him. But as soon as I passed, I did what I promised myself I wouldn't. I checked the rearview mirror, and he was still facing me. I told my coworker about it the next day, and she shrugged it off. Probably just some creep, she said. Next time, take a different route home. So I did. I took the long way, added 10 minutes to my drive. That night, I didn't see him, but the night after, he was standing at the entrance of my apartment complex. I didn't park. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, my pulse hammering in my ears. I made a full loop around the block, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. When I finally worked up the courage to return, he was gone. I checked every shadow, every parked car, every doorway. Nothing, just the hum of streetlights and the distant bark of a dog. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I asked the security guard at my complex if he'd seen anything unusual. He frowned and shook his head. Nothing weird, but hey, your car wasn't parked in its usual spot last night, was it? My stomach dropped. No, I said slowly. Why? He hesitated. Well, around 3 a.m., someone knocked on the front gate. Real quiet, real polite. I checked the cameras, but he rubbed his neck. The feed cut out for about 10 minutes. Just static. I moved out that week. I still take the long way home, and I never ever checked my rearview mirror. Moving out didn't help. For the first week, I told myself it was over. I was in a new apartment, a new neighborhood, a new commute. I stuck to well-lit roads, avoided cemeteries, and forced myself to stop looking over my shoulder. But some habits are hard to break. One night, about 2 weeks after I moved, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror again. It was just instinct, just a glance, and I saw a standing at the crosswalk behind me. At first, I thought it was someone else, but no, same stiff posture, same motionless stance, just waiting, watching. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached. The light turned green. I drove. I didn't look back. I started to see him more often after that. Not every night, not always in the same place, but enough that I stopped convincing myself I was imagining it. He never got closer, never chased me, never spoke. He was just there, at a gas station, standing by the air pump while I filled my tires. Outside my work, across the street, hands at his sides. Even in a grocery store once, I turned down an aisle, and he was at the far end, staring straight at me. No cart, no groceries, just standing there. I turned around and left without buying anything. The worst part, I could never really describe him. I tried. I really did. I even told a friend, half laughing, trying to play it off like some weird coincidence. He's just tall, I guess, and pale, but I could never really see his face. My friend gave me a look. How could you not see his face? I didn't know how to explain it. It wasn't that it was blurred or missing, it was just wrong. Like my brain refused to hold on to it. Every time I tried to remember, it slipped away like a dream. One night, after months of this, I snapped. I was parked outside my apartment, gripping my keys, exhausted, sick of feeling hunted. And when I turned my head, there he was, standing by a street lamp. I rolled down my window and shouted, "What do you want?" He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react at all. He just tilted his head, like he was considering the question, and then he took one step forward. That was enough. I threw my car into drive and sped off, circling the block 3 times before parking and sprinting inside my building. Heart hammering in my chest. That was the last time I saw him. I don't know why. I don't know if he got bored, if he found someone else, or if acknowledging him out loud broke whatever strange hold he had over me. I just know that it stopped. But even now, even years later, I still take the long way home, and I never ever check my rearview mirror. For a while, I let myself believe it was over. Months passed, I got comfortable, the world felt normal again, until last week. I was visiting my parents in my hometown, a couple of hours away. Just a weekend visit, dinner, catching catching up, some quality time. It had been long enough that I felt safe, untouched. But that night, as I was helping my mom clean up the dishes, she glanced out the window and frowned. There's someone standing outside. Every muscle in my body locked up. I turned my head so slowly it felt like a dream, and there he was, standing at the end of my parents' driveway, still watching. I couldn't breathe. My mom squinted. Do you know him? I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, already moving toward the front door, though I managed to choke out. Don't. She hesitated, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. Honey, if someone's lurking outside, we should know about the lock the door. Maybe it was the way my voice cracked. Maybe it was the sheer panic in my face, but she listened. She locked the door, and then she locked the back one too. For the rest of the night, I barely spoke. I pretended everything was fine, but I knew he was still there. I could feel it. When I finally went to bed, I checked every window in my room 3 times. Nothing, just the empty street, the sound of crickets, and the wind moving through the trees. But I didn't sleep. I stayed up, clutching my phone, watching the clock. At 3:13 a.m., my phone vibrated. Unknown number. Are you home? I nearly dropped it. My hand shook as I typed. Who is this? The reply came instantly. I turned off my phone and sat in the dark, listening. Waited. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streaming through my curtains. Birds chirping. I checked my phone with numb fingers. No new messages. No missed calls. Like it had never happened. At breakfast, my mom glanced up from her coffee. Oh, by the way, she said, whoever that was last night, they must have left something for you. My stomach dropped. What? She nodded toward the front door. There was an envelope on the porch this morning. I didn't want to look, but I had to. It was a plain, unmarked envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just sitting there, waiting. I picked it up with shaking hands and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. A picture of me, standing at my car, taken from behind. And at the very bottom, in tiny, scrawled handwriting, I missed you. I didn't finish my breakfast. I didn't say goodbye. I just packed my bags, got in my car, and drove. I don't know how he found me. I don't know how he knew. I travel a lot for work. Late nights, long layovers, and empty terminals are all part of the routine. I never really thought much about them until that night. I was on a late night connection at a smaller regional airport, not one of the major hubs, but big enough to have multiple concourses. My flight had been delayed twice, leaving me stranded in a nearly empty wing. The few shops and kiosks were closed, and the only other passengers I'd seen had long since disappeared onto their flights. It was just me, my carry-on, and the occasional garbled announcement over the intercom. I found a seat near my gate and settled in, scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the unsettling silence. No one else was around. No agents at the counter, no janitors, no security, nothing. It felt off. At first, I told myself it was normal. It was late, after all. But then I noticed something strange. Across the concourse, at another gate, someone was sitting. A woman. She was too far for me to see her clearly, but something about her posture was wrong and rigid. Like she wasn't just waiting for a flight, she was watching. I shifted uncomfortably, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just another stranded passenger, but she wasn't scrolling on her phone. She wasn't reading. She wasn't even looking at the departure screens. She was looking at me. I tried to ignore her. I went back to my phone, pretending not to notice. But every time I glanced up, she hadn't moved. Not once. Then the overhead lights dimmed. An announcement crackled over the intercom. Something about a final boarding call, but not for my flight. I glanced at my gate screen. Still delayed. I looked back at the woman. She was standing now, still staring. That's when I realized she hadn't come from another flight. She hadn't been there when I first sat down. She had just appeared. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I grabbed my bag, trying to look casual as I stood. My plan was simple: move closer to the main concourse, find an employee, find anyone else. I turned away from her. I only took 5 steps before the intercom buzzed again. Passenger, please return to your seat. Your flight is now boarding. I froze. I hadn't checked in at the counter. No one should know I was here. I turned back toward my gate. The woman was gone. The intercom crackled again. Passenger, please proceed to the jet bridge immediately. The screen at my gate still showed a delay. The door was still closed. There was no agent at the counter. Then I noticed something else. The jet bridge door was slightly open, dark, empty. I took a step back. A shadow moved inside the bridge. That was enough. I turned and walked fast back toward the main terminal, not daring to look back. By the time I reached the main concourse, I spotted a janitor, relief washing over me. I told him my flight had been delayed, but someone was announcing announcing boarding over the speakers. He frowned. Which gate? I turned to point. The concourse behind me was completely dark. No open jet bridge, no flickering gate screens, no wagon, nothing. I left the airport that night, booked a hotel, caught a flight the next morning. When I checked the airport's website later, something made my skin crawl. The flight number I'd been waiting for, it never existed. I don't know who or what was waiting for me at that gate, and I don't ever want to find out. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty jet bridge, the shadow moving inside it, the woman who shouldn't have been there. By morning, I was exhausted but eager to leave. I double-checked my new flight information, confirmed the airline and gate number myself, and made my way back to the airport. It felt different in daylight. Dorbe, bustling with passengers, employees, the usual chaos of travel. A part of me wondered if I'd overreacted, if maybe fatigue and an eerie coincidence had gotten the best of me. But as I walked towards security, I caught sight of something that froze me in place. At a small information kiosk near baggage claim, a large digital map displayed the airport layout. I scanned it, trying to pinpoint where I had been the night before, but the concourse I had waited in, it wasn't on the map. I felt sick. I flagged down an airport employee, a middle-aged woman with a kind but rushed demeanor. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I was here last night, waiting for a flight. My gate was in that concourse." I pointed at the blank space on the map. "But it's not here." She gave me a confused look. "That section was shut down last year," she said. "It's been under construction ever since." I felt the blood drain from my face. "No," I insisted. "I was there last night. There were working lights, a functioning intercom. Gate screens were on." She shook her head. "There's no power in that section," she said firmly. "There hasn't been for months." I tried to argue, but she had already turned away, radioing another employee. I stood there, breath shallow, brain scrambling for an explanation. Maybe she was mistaken. Maybe they had turned the power back on for some reason. Maybe I wasn't losing my mind. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I knew they turned around and left. But I forced myself forward, through security, into the terminal, sticking to the crowded areas, refusing to look too long at the gates I passed. When I finally boarded my flight, one that I confirmed with my own eyes, my own ears, I collapsed into my seat, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The plane took off smoothly, no delays, no strange announcements. But as we ascended, I made the mistake of looking out the window. The airport shrank below us, a sprawling maze of runways and buildings. And there, in the distance, I saw it, a dark, empty concourse, lifeless, abandoned. But just before we disappeared into the clouds, I saw something else. A figure standing at the end of a jet bridge, watching, waited for someone else to take the last flight out. I told myself I was done thinking about it. I landed, went straight to my hotel, and threw myself into work. Meetings, emails, phone calls, anything to push the night at the airport out of my head. But it stayed with me, like a bad dream that wouldn't fade. For the next few weeks, I avoided night flights. I even started double-checking every airport I traveled through, making sure I never ended up in a half-abandoned concourse again. Then, 3 weeks later, I got an email. It was from an unfamiliar address, the subject line empty. The body of the email contained only one thing, a screenshot of my boarding pass from that night, not the one I had booked after I left, the original one, the one for the flight that didn't exist. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting into knots. I never printed that pass. I never shared it, but someone or something had it. I hovered over the sender's email, expecting it to be a scam, a spoofed address, something explainable. It wasn't. The email was from my own account. I deleted it immediately. Then I deleted my entire inbox, reset my passwords, and even called my airline to ask if there had been any record of me being booked on that flight. The agent on the phone sounded confused. "There's no record of you booking that flight," she said. "I know," I replied, gripping my phone tighter. "But is there a record of anyone else on it?" She hesitated. "Sir, there is no flight with that number in our system. Not from that airport. Not that night. Not ever." I hung up. That should have been the end of it. I should have stopped looking, but I didn't. A few nights later, curiosity got the best of me. I searched online for anything about that airport, that concourse. There wasn't much, just vague mentions of renovations and old forum posts about a gate being permanently closed due to operational issues. Then I found something buried deep in the archives of an old travel site. A comment from 2006, "Avoid Concourse D if you're flying late." I was there once after a delay, alone except for one other passenger. She just sat there, staring, never boarded anything. When my flight was called, the intercom said my name, but I never checked in. The jet bridge was open, but the plane wasn't there. Just dark. I read, "I never flew through the airport again." Another comment, 2011. "There's something wrong with the last flights out of Concourse D. I worked at the airport years ago. Sometimes, flights would be listed on the schedule that didn't exist. If passengers showed up, an announcement would call their name, even if no one was at the desk. Security never found out who was making them." The last comment was from 2020. "I'd used to work overnights cleaning the terminals. We weren't supposed to go near Concourse D, but once I did. The screens were on, the gates looked operational, but it wasn't real. It couldn't be, because the airport shut that concourse down years ago. But I swear, I saw someone waiting there. I saw the bridge door open, and I swear, something saw me back. I closed my laptop. I haven't flown through the airport since, and I never take the last flight out, because whatever's waiting in that abandoned concourse, it's still there. It's still watching, and it's still waiting for the next name to be called. I used to work as a legal assistant at an old county courthouse. It was the kind of place that had been expanded over the years, an odd mix of modern offices mashed up against original brick corridors and staircases that led to nowhere. The building had character, sure, but it also had places where you could feel completely alone, even when you weren't. One of my tasks was sorting through old case files that were being moved from physical storage to digital archives. Most of these files were housed in a designated records room in the basement, but every now and then I'd get assigned a box from off-site storage. One day, my boss handed me a key. "This goes to the attic storage," she said. "You'll need to take the old staircase behind courtroom B." I'd never even known there was an attic, let alone storage up there, but eager to get the job done, I grabbed the key and went looking for the staircase. Courtroom B wasn't in use that day, so the chamber was dark except for the dim glow of emergency exit signs. The door to the stairwell was tucked into a corner, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. The lock was stiff, but I managed to turn the key, and with a push, the door groaned open. The air inside was different, dry and stale, with that thick dust smell that clings to old books. I flipped a switch, but the only light was a single bare bulb above the first landing. The stairs stretched up into darkness. I climbed slowly, my footsteps echoing too loudly. Halfway up, I hesitated. I don't know why. Maybe it was the weight of the silence, or the way the air felt just a little too still. But I shook it off and kept going. At the top, I found another door, slightly ajar. Beyond it was the attic storage, a cramped space filled with metal filing cabinets and rows of shelves packed with old case files. The dust here was thick, untouched in places. I found the box I was supposed to retrieve on a table near the door. That should have been the end of it. Grab the box, go back downstairs, business as usual. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. One of the filing cabinets was open just a crack. Not unusual, except that I could see the dust pattern on the handle, thick, undisturbed. It hadn't been touched in years. And yet, it was open. A chill crept up my spine. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it had been left open long ago, and I just hadn't noticed at first. I should have left then. Instead, I reached out and pulled the drawer open. The files inside were neat, organized, but sitting on top, at a place, was something that wasn't a file at all. It was a photograph, faded, old, but I could make it out. 4 people standing in what looked like this very attic. 2 men, 2 women, dressed in formal court attire. Judges, maybe, or attorneys, but it was their faces that stopped me. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at something just beyond the frame, and their expressions, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't fear, exactly, or like recognition, like they'd just seen something step into the room. And behind them, in the dim light, there was a shadow, not a person, a shape, stretched long, distorted. I dropped the photo and took a step back. That's when I heard it. A sound, soft at first, a scrape, a shuffle, from inside the attic. I turned so fast I nearly knocked over the table. The room was empty, just rows of cabinets and shelves, silent and unmoving. But the air felt wrong, heavy. Watching, I grabbed the box and bolted. I don't even remember running down the stairs. I just know I didn't stop until I was back in the main hallway where the air felt normal again. I turned to the files and never mentioned what I saw. A few weeks later, I tried to bring it up casually with one of the older clerks. "Hey, did you know there's an attic above courtroom B?" She gave me a puzzled look. "There used to be," she said, "years ago, but they sealed it off within 90 seconds. There's no way to get up there anymore." I didn't argue. I just nodded and walked away because I still had the key and the dust on my shoes. I should have left it alone. I wanted to leave it alone. After that day, I avoided courtroom B. I told myself I had imagined it, that maybe the clerk had just been mistaken about the attic being sealed off. But every time I walked past that part of the building, I felt it, the strange, heavy air, the sense that if I turned my head too quickly, I'd see something standing just out of sight. Then, about a month later, I was asked to retrieve another file. This time, my boss handed me a folder directly. "We pulled this one from the old archives," she said, placing it on my desk. The file was from the 1970s, an old case, something about a judicial misconduct investigation that had been shut down before it went to trial. But it wasn't the case itself that made my stomach drop. It was the photograph clipped inside, and the same photograph I had found in the attic. 4 people standing in that same dimly lit space. Their faces tense, their eyes locked on something just out of frame, the shadow behind them. But I swallowed hard and flipped through the case file. There were notes, transcripts, mentions of hearings and closed door meetings. And then, toward the end, something that made my blood run cold. A report, March 12, 1975. Following multiple complaints of disturbances in the upper records room, attic storage has been permanently closed off. Staff are advised to avoid the stairwell behind courtroom B key access has been revoked. I stared at the words, rereading them over and over. Permanently closed off, revoked access. Then how the hell had I gone up there? I still had the key. Without thinking, I reached into my drawer, pulling it out. It felt cold, heavier than I remembered. I had to know. That night, long after everyone else had gone home, I made my way back to courtroom B. The hallway was silent, the air thick. My footsteps echoed too loudly as I approached the door to the stairwell. I reached for the handle, looked. I exhaled, feeling something close to relief. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had been inside some other storage room and let my mind play tricks on me. But then, with shaking fingers, I slid the key into the lock, and it turned. The door creaked open. The stairwell stretched into darkness. The same stale, dust-heavy air poured out, wrapping around me. This time, I didn't climb. I just stood there, staring up into the black, listening, and then a step, without an echo, a step above me, then another, and another, growing closer. The air went ice cold. My body locked up. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. And then I heard it, a whisper, low, distorted. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them pressing into my skull, curling around my spine. I slammed the door shut and sprinted down the hall, not stopping until I was outside, gasping in the open air. I quit the next morning. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't answer my boss's calls, and I threw that key into the river. I don't know what's in that attic, but whatever it is, it knows me now. I left town. I told myself I was done with that place, with whatever was in that attic. I moved 3 states away, took a job at a private law firm, and tried my best to forget. It worked for a while, but then the letters started coming. At first, they were easy to ignore. No return address, just plain envelopes with my name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. I assumed they were junk or mistaken mail, but after the 4th one arrived at my new apartment, I finally opened one. Inside was a single piece of paper. You still have the key. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't have the key. I had thrown it into the river. I had watched it sink beneath the surface. I tore up the letter, convinced it was a prank. Maybe a former coworker messing with me, though I had never told anyone what happened. But then a 5th letter arrived. This time, there was something else inside. A photograph. Not the old one, the one from the attic. No, this one was new. Crisp. Taken in a well-lit room. Taken in my living room. My hand shook as I flipped it over. On the back, and the same neat handwriting, was a date. March 12th, the same date from the courthouse report. The date the attic was sealed off. I don't remember locking my door that night, but I must have, because I woke up to the sound of someone trying it. Not knocking, not breaking in, just testing the lock. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I called out of work and drove 5 hours to the nearest town with a courthouse that still had paper records. I had to know more. I dug through old newspaper archives, scanned through legal notices, anything that might tell me what happened in 1975. And then I found it, a small article buried in the back pages of the local paper. Attorney found dead in courthouse attic. I read the words over and over. The article gave little detail, only that a local defense attorney, James Holloway, had been found dead in the courthouse attic storage room late one night. Officials ruled it a heart attack, but coworkers claimed he had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his death, talking about something watching him, mentioning an old key he had found. My blood ran cold. I flipped back to the case file I had found weeks earlier, the one with the old photograph. Holloway's name was in it. He had been part of that closed-door investigation, and he had died in the attic. I shut the file and got back in my car. I was done. I wasn't going to dig any deeper, but as I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing across the street. Tall, too tall, its head tilted slightly, watching me. I didn't stop driving. That night, I slept with the lights on, my apartment barricaded. No more letters came, no more photographs. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I hear it. A door creaking open, a step, slow and deliberate, in a whisper right outside my bedroom door. I was working as a night janitor at a corporate building downtown. It wasn't a particularly interesting job, just vacuuming, emptying trash, wiping down surfaces. The place was usually empty after 8 p.m., aside from the occasional late worker in one of the offices. One night, I was going about my usual rounds when I noticed something odd. Down the hall, in the reflection of the large glass windows, I saw a man standing completely still near the vending machines. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and just watching. At first, I assumed he was just another late worker coworker taking a break. But when I turned to look directly at him, the space where he should have been was empty. I blinked and looked back at the window. He was still there, reflected in the glass. I felt this weird, cold weight in my stomach. Something was wrong. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart thudding, and glanced again toward the vending machine area. Still nothing, but in the reflection, the man tilted his head. I bolted. I half jogged, half speed walked to the janitor's closet, locked myself inside, and tried to calm my breathing. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe it was a weird trick of the light. After about 10 minutes, I convinced myself I had imagined it. I cautiously stepped out and went back to work, avoiding that part of the building entirely. A week later, I was cleaning the empty reception area when I saw him again. This time, he wasn't reflected in a window. He was standing in the middle of the room, motionless, watching me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and black. Not dark brown, just black, like the entire eyeball was void of color. I don't remember dropping my mop, but I heard it clatter against the floor. The man didn't move, didn't breathe. He just stared. Then, in a slow, almost mechanical motion, his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. I don't think I've ever run faster in my life. I quit the next morning. I didn't even go back for my last paycheck. I just never stepped foot in that building again. A month later, I bumped into one of the other janitors at a bus stop. We made small talk, and I asked, as casually as I could, if he'd ever seen anything strange in the building. His face darkened immediately. You saw him too, didn't you? I nodded, my mouth dry. He let out a shaky breath. We don't talk about it. I never asked anything more, and I never went near that building again. A few months passed, and I did my best to forget about the incident. I found a new job, day shifts only. I made sure of that. Life went back to something resembling normal. Then, one evening, as I was walking home from a friend's apartment, I caught a glimpse of something in a store window. A reflection. At first, I thought it was my own, just a trick of the dim street lights and glass. But then I saw him, standing just behind me, so perfectly still, those same black, unblinking eyes. I turned sharply, hard hammering, expecting to see him right there in the open street. But there was nothing. I turned back to the window, but the reflection was gone. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe my brain had dredged up an old fear, warping some random shadow into him. I walked the rest of the way home with my fists clenched in my jacket pockets, refusing to look at any more reflections. For a while, nothing happened. No glimpses of it, no strange feelings of being watched. I convinced myself that it had been a lingering paranoia, nothing real. Then one night, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. He left too soon. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was spam, a wrong number, anything. But my fingers trembled as I locked my phone and tossed it onto the bed. I barely slept that night. The next morning, there was another text. I said you. That was it. No threats, no demands. Just those 3 words. I blocked the number immediately, but for the next few days, every reflective surface felt like a trap. I avoided mirrors, car windows, even puddles on the sidewalk. It didn't matter. One night, I was brushing my teeth when I made the mistake of glancing up at the bathroom mirror. There he was. Not behind me, not in the doorway, inside the mirror. His face was inches from mine. His grin stretched so wide it looked unnatural, wrong. His eyes, completely black, were locked onto mine, and then his lips moved. I couldn't hear him. There was no sound, but I knew exactly what he was saying. Let me in. I don't remember turning, don't remember running. I just know I spent the night in my car, parked at a well-lit gas station, doors locked, shaking. I moved out of that apartment the next day. It's been years now. I don't use mirrors anymore. I keep my phone's screen dimmed so I don't catch accidental reflections. I even avoid the glass doors at stores. Most days, I tell myself it's over, that he was just some manifestation of stress, a trick of the mind. But sometimes, when I pass by dark windows at night, I feel like something's looking back. Wait, it's been 5 years. 5 years of avoiding reflections, moving to new cities, changing my number, deleting social media. 5 years of telling myself he wasn't real. I've convinced myself it was all in my head. That's what I tell people when they ask why I don't keep mirrors in my home, when they joke about my weird habit of never looking into glass doors or shiny surfaces. In most days, I believe it, but then something happened last night. I was walking home from work, nothing unusual. It was late, but the streets were still busy. The glow of neon signs reflected off the wet pavement, distorted in the puddles left by the rain. Then I noticed something, the puddle up ahead. At first, it looked normal, just rippling from the occasional gust of wind. But then the ripples stopped completely, and I saw him standing in the reflection, not beside me, not behind me, just inside the puddle, staring, grinning. I stopped walking, my breath caught in my throat. People moved around me, brushing past, but none of them noticed. None of them looked down. Then, ever so slightly, his head tilted, the way it had that first night. I couldn't move. My body was ice, my lungs felt too tight. My brain was screaming, don't look, don't look, don't look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. His mouth moved. No sound, no whisper, just the same silent, silent, horrible movement of his lips. Let me end. And then he blinked. I stumbled back, gasping. The reflection shattered, rippling violently. When I looked again, the puddle was just a puddle. I ran the rest of the way home, shaking so hard I could barely get my keys into the lock. Once I was inside, I locked every door, turned on every light. I even covered the bathroom mirror with a towel, just in case. And then, at 3:12 a.m., I got a text. No number, no contact name, just 2 words. Almost there. I haven't slept. My hands are still shaking as I type this. I don't know what he wants, but I think I let him get too close. I took a part-time job at the Natural History Museum. It wasn't a glamorous position, mostly cataloging, assisting with the occasional school tour, and making sure nobody tried to steal the taxidermy exhibits. The museum itself was old, the kind of place that smelled like dust and mothballs no matter how much it was cleaned, but it had its charm, particularly in the East Wing where the ornithology collection was housed. The room wasn't open to the public. It was a private research archive filled with thousands of meticulously labeled bird specimens, some over 100 years old, their glassy eyes forever staring into nothing. I had to work in there sometimes, filing reports or retrieving samples for visiting scientists. It should have been quiet, peaceful, even, but I hated being in that room. There was something off about it. The air felt heavier, like it resisted movement. The floorboards creaked in ways that didn't always match my footsteps, and though I tried to dismiss it, there were times when I swore the birds weren't always facing the same way they had been before. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. A place like that, dimly lit and filled with thousands of unblinking eyes, could play tricks on anyone's mind. But then, late one evening, I learned I wasn't imagining things. It was just past closing. The security guards had already done their rounds, and I was the last one still inside. I had gone back to the ornithology archive to retrieve the misplaced file before heading out. I didn't hear anyone coming behind me, but when I reached for the cabinet, I felt something shift in the room. Not a sound, not a breeze, just a change. I turned around, part hammering, nothing. I let out a shaky breath, grabbed the file, and started to leave. That's when I noticed it. One of the specimens, a great horned owl mounted on the highest shelf, was turned completely around, its head twisted 180 degrees, staring at the back wall instead of the room. I stabbed cold. I hadn't bumped the shelf. The museum didn't have earthquakes, and yet, somehow, a bird that hadn't moved in decades had changed its position. I forced myself to keep walking, pushing down the sick feeling in my stomach. Don't run, I told myself. Just leave. I was almost at the door when I heard it. It fluttered, a dry, papery rustling, like wings moving against old fabric. I turned back just in time to see the owl's head slowly turning back toward me. I read, and I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. I never went into that room alone again. A few weeks later, an older curator, one who had worked there for decades, must have noticed how tense I was whenever I was near that wing. Gets to you, doesn't it? He said, watching me shelve a file with unsteady hands. I forced a laugh. It's just eerie in there. He nodded, as if he understood exactly what I meant. You know, he said, almost casually, some of those specimens were collected over 100 years ago. Back then, people believed if you didn't prepare them properly, a little bit of their spirit stayed behind. I never asked him what he meant by prepare properly, and I never worked after closing again. I tried to push what happened in the ornithology archive out of my mind, but the museum had a way of holding onto things. Even when I avoided that room, I felt something watching. The feeling would creep up on me when I was alone in the staff lounge or shelving records in the basement. It wasn't just paranoia, I started noticing things. Small things, at first. Once, I left my locker door closed, only to find it wide open when I returned. Another time, I swear I heard the faintest hoo-hoo echoing from the vents, low and guttural, like something struggling to breathe. Then, one night, something happened that made me wish I had quit sooner. It was storming outside, and I had been roped into staying late to help set up a temporary exhibit. Around midnight, I was heading toward the exit when I realized I had left my work ID back in the archives. I didn't want to go back, not at that hour, but if I forgot it, security would give me hell in the morning. So, reluctantly, I headed back. The hallways were empty, just a dull flicker of emergency lighting casting warped shadows along the walls. As I neared the archive, I swore I could hear something soft and faint, a shuffling sound. I hesitated at the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to turn back, but I forced myself forward, just grab the ID and go. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The room felt different, colder, heavier, like all the air had been sucked out. The specimens sat in their usual places, rows of glassy eyes reflecting reflecting the dim light, except one, the great horned owl. It was no longer on its shelf. It was on the table, face away. I swallowed the scream rising in my throat and backed away. My 499 was sitting right next to it, but there was no way in hell I was reaching for it now. Then I heard it, that fluttering, a dry, raspy sound, like ancient feathers brushing together. My breath hitched. I turned toward the doorway, ready to run, but the door was closed. I didn't close it. I lunged for the handle, yanking hard. It wouldn't budge. It was like something was pressing against it from the other side. Then the lights flickered, and the whispering started. Not words, just a soft, rustling breath, like wind through hollow bones. It came from behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see. I squeezed my eyes shut and started banging on the door, screaming for help. My hands felt numb. The air around me felt thick, pressing it on my lungs like it didn't want me to leave. Then, a sound like breaking glass. The pressure lifted, and the door flew open, sending me sprawling into the hallway. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, expecting to see something, someone chasing me. But when I looked back, the room was empty. Everything was exactly as it had been before, except for the great horned owl. It was back on the shelf, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, watching me. I didn't go back for my ID. I quit the next morning, never set foot at that museum again. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a soft fluttering sound outside my window, and I never look. I quit the museum. I told myself I was free of it, that I'd never have to step foot in that cursed place again. But some things don't let go so easily. For the first few weeks, I tried to convince myself I was just paranoid, that what happened in the ornithology archive was stress, a trick of the mind. But then, things started following me. Not people, not shadows, birds. At first, it was small things, a feather on my windowsill, though I lived in a high-rise apartment with no nearby trees. A muffled rustling in the vents at night, but it escalated. I started noticing owls. A barn owl, perched on a telephone wire across from my building. A snowy owl, completely out of place, watching from the park near my office. They never moved, just stared. One night, I woke up gasping, my throat tight like I had been suffocating in my sleep. My room was pitch dark, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, like the museum archive, and then I heard it, a soft, dry flutter. I bolted upright, reaching for my bedside lamp. My fingers fumbled for the switch, but before I could turn it on, I saw something in the dim glow of the street lights outside. My closet door was open. I never left it open, and inside, two glassy eyes were staring at me. I turned on the light. Nothing. The closet was empty, but the next morning, I found something on my pillow. A small, brittle owl tablet. I should have left town, should have burned everything I owned and started over somewhere far away, but I didn't. I tried to ignore it. I tried to move on, and then a week later, I got a call. It was from one of the old museum curators. His voice was hushed, nervous. He told me that after I left, they had closed the ornithology archive indefinitely. When I asked why, his voice dropped lower. They found something, he said, behind the old shelving units. I gripped my phone tighter. What? There was a pause. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, a door. It was sealed shut, but something scratched at it from the inside. I hung up. That was 2 months ago. I moved across the country, cut off contact with everyone from the museum, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that soft fluttering. And a few days ago, I found something outside my new apartment. A small pile of owl feathers. I don't think I ever really left, and I don't think it's done with me. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.